Coming. I'm Suzanne Herron. I sort of organize these Soroptimist Leadership Institute workshops. And I just want to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting from many ancestral territories, both unceded and treatied, and thanking the First Nations communities, past, present, and future, for their stewardship, their care, and their leadership on these lands that we meet on. And we acknowledge that we are guests on these lands. And we give thanks to the ancestors, the leaders, the matriarchs, preachers, big and small, for looking after the rich resources and the cultural teachings of these beautiful lands. And let us commit to being better guests than those who came before us and go forward in respect and reconciliation. And here is once again Sandy Stevens of SI Nelson in New Zealand. So thank you, Sandy. And part 2 of project management is yours.
Thanks, Suzanne. Well, I don't think any of you will have forgotten the main theme of our last session was SMART objectives. And I hope that you had a chance since that time to think about yours so that they would be measurable, specific, achievable, etc. and time-bound, because that really is the core of a good project plan, I think. So once you've thought about your project objectives, that should conjure up in your mind a snappy title for your project. I wonder if any of you have got a really good example of a snappy title that reflects what you're trying to do, but is memorable, concise, and descriptive, etc. Has anyone got one?
I have, Sandy, if you want to hear it, because I'm doing
Yes,
something
please.
on the 6th of March next year. Ovarian cancer outcomes, focusing the lens, help us make a difference.
Oh, very good. I think everyone would agree that's snappy, and it certainly puts the message out there, doesn't it?
Yep.
I
Thank you. I'll go ahead on that.
One of the things I did when I was trying to think of snappy titles was have a prize for the best one from the local school. And those kids, secondary school, came up with some wonderful ideas. So, you know, there are resources around you that can help you with that sort of thing too. So the title is great. It should be, you know, up there in everybody's eyes in the spotlight. Hopefully you remember also, as the design emerges, that you are under the umbrella of Soroptimists, which has its long-term Soroptimist International Vision, and it has a mission statement, and it has principles. If we keep those in mind, then everything we do will be focusing for bettering the lives of women and girls and their families. So the other thing to remember is that we have consultative status to the United Nations. So the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, they're also important. Just think about when your project's emerging, which of the SDGs does it actually address? Because every year we have to report on those, and the international body sends that report to the UN. So whatever your club has done to include the SDGs in its project design, that's helpful too. Let's go on then. I was just dealing in that one with the fact that we need to be very concise in those early statements. The title should be extremely concise. That was a brilliant one that was quoted before. That was Raylene, was it, from Hokitika?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great example. Somebody sent me one saying community improvement initiative, and that tells you absolutely nothing. Which community, what improvement, what kind of initiative. So that was one of the worst cases, and I was going to have a group session on improving that one, but we haven't got the overhead slides, or whatever we call them nowadays, the Zoom slides. We won't do that because that set out a few things. We'll go on to writing. This is important. These are all in the template I sent you after the last session. So it's section number 4, slide number 4, rather, section number 2, background and justification. Now that will be maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs describing what you're trying to do to address a problem you've identified and justify it. So your stakeholder analysis will be reflected in that background and justification statement. And your any community issues, the sustainability issues, who's going to own the project? Is it going to be a Soroptimist project forever and ever? Or is it going to have a transition to being owned by whoever are the beneficiaries one day? Is it a community endeavor, or is it a individual person you're working with to help them change something? Is it part of something bigger? Does it come under some policies that are going to be a barrier? Are the people who will be in opposition? This comes under, some people carry out a formal risk analysis to see what will be the obstacles and barriers that we face. So that section, number 2 in the template, called background and justification, will set out the main issues. What is the problem? What is the scope of the problem? Is it a big problem, or is it a little contained problem? What will your project try to do? And that will be reflected in the objectives. What will it try to do to address that problem, to reach the goal, which is to solve the problem? And who are the stakeholders? So we talked last time about stakeholder analysis. They will be not only the people who will benefit from the project, but those who will contribute to it, and those who may be at risk of harm from the project. For example, if you're going to take some resources from one sector of the community, are they going to object to that? And if so, what will you do to mediate that problem? Do you have people who have different values who are going to undermine your efforts? This comes particularly in education and awareness raising, and you can get all sorts of obstacles thrown from left field. So if you carry out a risk analysis and you identify something that's a big problem, you want to reflect it in the background, just to remind people that the design from then on must be aware that there will be problems and they have to be addressed. It might mean throwing in a few extra resources to solve that problem. So, and then we had the section number 3 on the project goal, which is the broad statement of what it is you want to see in place in the long term. It's not a series of activities. It's the goal that you want to achieve to see in place when the project's completed. But that's followed by section 4, which is the project objectives. And they're more specific. That's where we talked about being smart. And the smarter they are, the more useful they are. So everybody knows exactly what to do if the objectives are smart. The template then goes on to the results, which I call outputs and outcomes, but some people call results and some people call immediate results and long-term results. Whatever words suit you, it doesn't matter to me at all. But remember that results will not all be positive. There may be unforeseen negatives that manifest as the project goes along. And that means you've got to be flexible. I always put in a budget a contingency allowance of perhaps 10% to allow for unforeseen problems. And that might mean a technology that needs to be brought in. It might mean an awareness raising session that needs to be included that you didn't foresee because some people are against something that you didn't realize in the beginning. So that contingency is, some people put a very small amount, 3%, but I usually put 10%. It depends on the nature of the project. If you don't use it, there's always a useful place to put that money at the end of the project. So the outputs and the outcomes will be in 2 sections, as I said. The immediate results, and they may come in steps as the project goes along. You may have some immediate results after the initial activities. Awareness raising might be your first activity, which includes a part of education. You may want to measure that change and see if there's a change in awareness by asking people to tell you something that will allow you to measure their level of awareness. But it might be concrete things, like if you're trying to make a profit, what will the profit line be? As it goes up and you make more money, that's very easily recorded in the accounts. If your objective is to change people's practices, That's less easy to manage, but you can do it using a skills test with a scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 6, 1 to 10, and measure where people are on that scale. In pre-literate societies, which doesn't apply to any of us, I think, but I've used colors, like traffic light colors. So if everybody knows something, they go under the green. If no one knows, they're red. And in between, you've got amber. You can have shades of yellow, shades of turquoise before you get to green. So there are ways to do it with everybody, and hard statistics are not always necessary. Also, it's not necessary to gather a lot of data as statistics because that requires somebody to do the work. Some of these things can be done during your meetings with a show of hands or in a focus group. Just how many people enjoyed the trip to the beach? That's a very, very simple one, but a show of hands would tell you the answer immediately. If you're talking about awareness raising and education, which is a bit more difficult to measure, we need to have some criteria in place. And I'll be talking in the last session, the final session, about that. How do you measure the unmeasurable? Everything can be measured, and there are ways to do it that we'll talk about next time. I don't know if you're familiar with the word key performance indicators, KPIs. They're commonly used in business and so on, but KPIs are an essential part of assessment of results, key performance indicators. They are the key things you expect to see to judge your project's success. So, yeah, I'm lost without the slides because I can't see what I had in them, but let me try to remember what was there. You need two things. You need, once you've chosen an indicator, let's say you're going to measure people's level of skill in conducting an activity. Let's say, for simplicity, making an apron, stitching an apron, making an apron. A key performance indicator would be an apron that fits well and does the job on the person who's wearing it, that it's going to last some time, that it's washable, and so on. Those are all indicators of success in making this apron. What will you measure? You don't want to make it a big job. It's a very simple task. You could measure people's satisfaction with it. If most people say that it does the job after wearing it for 3 months, using it for 3 months, that's your success indicator. So that would be your KPI. Your key performance indicator would be the number of people who find it of acceptable standard to do the job. If it's something like producing some goods and services, or what would be something that you do? Let's say you're I'm trying to think of an example of things we've done here. Raising money for scholarships for students to complete a qualification that will lead to better employment. That's quite a complicated idea, but what would be your KPIs for that? One would be to raise enough money. That's, you want to fund 10 girls to go to study at university. You know how much you want to raise. If you raise that amount, 100% done. What is more interesting is whether those same recipients of the award completed the training that they undertook to do with that money. Because a lot of people start things and never finish them. So another key performance indicator would be how many out of those who started completed successfully and got their diploma, their certificate, their degree, whatever it was. That's another key performance indicator. But even more important than that, I think, is the impact of what that qualification enabled them to do. So I would ignore those early performance indicators. They can be measured, they can be recorded as success, but more important is the indicator at the end that contacts those girls 5 years after or 2 years after they completed the course and see how many are in full-time employment, if that's what they wanted, how many are finding job satisfaction, how many are getting an income that is commensurate with their level of skill, etc. You can think of the questions, but many people take the first one, fundraising, okay, we raised the money, done. Tick the box, 100% success. But there are often more things. Here we are with the sharing. I'll just finish what I was saying there, that there are things that are more important. And my big thing is always the impact of a project. Not that it was completed successfully. Those things are important. They're absolutely necessary. But the interesting part of the goal, achieving the long-term goal, is the impact that activity had on the lives of the people who benefited from it. So I think that's the area where we, as a club in Nelson anyway, are least successful. We don't record, we don't even ask the impact of something after completion. We just congratulate ourselves that everybody did their job, the money was spent where it was meant to be spent, and the project is completed successfully. So that was the main point from that. Okay, we'll go back now. This is the beginning of the talk. Well, I've said this, and I think it's pretty much planted in your minds now. This PowerPoint can be sent out to anybody who wants it after the session. You can go back through. But concise, the title must be concise. There's the sample project title coming up. Community Improvement Initiative. And I was going to go into groups, but you know, it's 2:30 already. Well, whatever time it is for you, it's 2:30.
Right. Next slide.
Yeah, next slide. So this is the components again. So the problem definition, clearly state the issue the project will address. So I've said that earlier today.
Right.
The issue may be that people want something. They want a water fountain. Do they really? Or does the club think it would be a good thing to give them? That's to be addressed. That's part of your stakeholder analysis, and it's part of your risk assessment. If people, I mean, people are polite. They won't say no to a project if you offer it and you're going to do all the work, but it's not sustainable in that case because they won't take ownership and they won't look after it and they won't maintain it, and very soon it'll join the rest of technology that's been given under aid programs forever and ever. So stakeholders, project scope, your project sits in a context of other things that are happening in people's lives. So it's good under the scoping to put fences around what your project's actually going to do. You can't do everything. So just state somewhere in that background paragraph the extent and scope of your project vis-a-vis the wider community beyond. And risk assessment, well, that's also done. It's part of your stakeholder analysis, but it's also part of your talking to experts in the field. For example, we had the one just a few minutes ago of ovarian cancer. Soroptimists are not ovarian cancer specialists. They want to help women and they want to promote early diagnosis. But you need to talk to professionals before you embark on anything like an education or awareness campaign to be sure that your messages, what you're printing in your pamphlets and what you're saying in your awareness sessions and in the education that you run with women's groups, that what you're saying is in line, A, with government policy, because if you go against government policy, you're going to have to find the resources quite separate from the government resources, that it's in line with the thinking or the treatments and the diagnoses of the time, and they keep changing. So you need to consult professionals about that. Make sure your messages are up to date. If you're mentioning anything like treatments, I mean, they change on a daily basis just about. So you do need to bring in the professionals and then let them go. You get on with what you can do as a Soroptimist group. And part of the risk assessment will also, as I said, be what are the obstacles on the way? You might have religious opposition to some things. You'll have misogyny, no doubt. That's still widespread and has to be tackled as part of a project if it means making the project acceptable to the wider community. So risk assessment, yes, the better you do that, the more you can anticipate what you're dealing with in the project. Next slide. Goals, again, I've talked about that, concise. I think it's good in the goal to indicate the time frame, because people don't want to commit to something. If they glance at it and see that it's 5 years, they may say that we don't want to participate in that because we don't know if we'll be around that long. Or if they see that it's 1 year, they might say that's too short, that's ridiculous. Why are they doing it in 1 year? They won't make any difference at all. And so to get people wanting to support you, I think a realistic time frame around the goal indicating that would be useful. And sustainable, of course. Once the Soroptimists have finished helping, who is going to take responsibility and how are they going to do it? The details will be down below in the project design, but you could indicate these things. Okay, next slide. This is where we do the SMART objectives, which you'll remember from last time. Don't leave out how specific you want to be, depends on the project, but don't leave out things just because you think they're difficult to measure. They should mention everything you want to happen. And the objectives can be 2, 3, 4. Sometimes you may even need to write 5 or 6 objectives, but don't write them unless they're necessary, because you don't need a whole list of objectives. Achievable, yeah, you've been through all that. The ones I saw, people who sent them to me, they were pretty darn good. So it's progress, I think. Next slide. And again, I talked about this a little while ago. So the results, the outcomes and outputs. So immediate results, long-term, and the change indicators. I don't know if you remember last time I said, when you're doing a project that changes something, it's good to be aware of what you're changing. And there are 3 areas of change which you may tackle in a project. The first is economic. Are you trying to address a shortage of something, money, food, clothing, education? If there's a shortage and you want to address that, just be clear in your head, is the change an economic one? And if so, how do you address it as an economic problem? Is it a social problem? And if it's more social, like people's attitudes to something, or their values, or their customs, or their culture, these must be certainly spelled out in the objectives, so that your results actually show that you have tackled that problem. Social problems. Often economic problems are caused not so much by a lack of resources, but by attitudes, values, culture, religion, etc. And then the third area of change is political. And that's where you want to know who has the decision-making power over whatever it is you want power over to make decisions. It might be over a woman's body, the subject of abortion or euthanasia, maybe that's something you're going to tackle. I wish you luck if you do, because they're very contentious. But you've got to be aware that it's not necessarily an economic problem. or a social problem. It might simply be a political problem. Sometimes men think they own women's bodies, for example, and that's a power thing. It has to be tackled very differently from just a health issue, which would come under social change. So those three changes, political, economic, and social, are three different areas of change that you might be trying to achieve through your project. Don't waste time on the area which is least important, but focus on the one where change is really needed. And then the change indicators will be specific indicators of what it is you want to see changed as a result of the project. Is it people's economic status with money or resources? Land rights was one that I dealt with a lot in my work, because in some countries, women have no right to own land. And in other countries, private people have no right to own land. In my own country, our Indigenous population had no concept of private ownership of land before they were colonized. So when land deals were made, it was two different sets of understanding, signing documents that neither understood, the other didn't understand. So, the repercussions still go on today. It's still in our courts. It'll go on for maybe decades more. So, yes, those three areas of change and indicators that measure what it is you're trying to change are important to think about at this point.
Sandy,
yeah.
Darlene put a question into the chat about two clubs working together to do a Dream It Be It conference for girls, for high school girls. And their title is Be a Leader of Your Life. And she's wondering what might be some key performance indicators.
Wow. That's a wonderful title, I think. It really does capture some thinking. But the key performance indicators, you would have to sit down and be very sure what it is what you mean by leadership. And then measure that. Do you mean simply somebody who's going to take decision-making power away from the masses and assume it himself or herself?
What we're trying to do is provide an opportunity for the young participants to meet with various mentors, both youth and adult mentors in different careers. We will have a large career education resource and volunteer fair. So I think it's just that opportunity to hear how someone's journey went along the way and to learn about different resources, but for them to have some tools, hopefully for them to think about what they might want to be in the future. And the future might also be now.
Yep. So what you would measure, Darlene, would be things like a key performance indicator might be capacity among those young people to make decisions about something where they wouldn't have before. Because of the mentoring, they're going to have more confidence in making their own decisions about their own lives or their resources or their futures. And so you would measure that level of confidence. So your key performance indicator might be that, just level of confidence in decision making. It's a political change, but it has huge economic implications too for the future.
And we might want to look at doing, how are you feeling when they first arrive, and then how they might feel at the end. And many of our clubs in our federation, that's one of our 2 dream programs, is the Dream It Be It. Now, some of the clubs have changed the name, but basically it's that opportunity to bring young women, non-binary and trans youth who feel comfortable coming to our conference and making it fun, inspiring, and informative.
Fantastic. There's a lot you could measure in that, but you don't want to burden yourself with endless measuring either. So I would sit down with my friends and the participants that you're working with and say, what are the key things that you would like to see come out of this? What is it that would give you that confidence to manage your own lives in the way you want them to be, live them the
Mhm.
way you want them to be accepted by the community. And is that change going to be within them, or does it require change in the wider community to gain acceptance? So you need to have that focus group discussion to decide what is the key thing for them and for the project.
Thank you. And we do have a youth advisory group that's made up of some of our past participants, and some of our those individuals are also our youth award winners. And we have someone who I met at a community Women Rising seminar that's just joined. She's not yet a Soroptimist, but she's on the advisory committee, and she is now on this call as well.
Okay.
Yutinda, yes.
Key performance indicators have to have buy-in from your stakeholders. Because if you think that something is the most important outcome from your project and they don't agree with you, they think something else is the more important, then you're not going to achieve, I mean, the project isn't going to achieve what it sets out to achieve. The one that Darlene mentioned, Dreamtime and so on, that's a very sensitive area. It involves all aspects of change, really, social, cultural, could be religious, but fundamentally, it's the confidence to be who you are and believe in yourself and take power back. If you feel power's been taken away, take it back. And this would require that the stakeholders, it could be part of the original stakeholder analysis, or it could be a second meeting later on after you've kind of agreed on the basic project design. You could say, now we need to have a talk about the key performance indicators. What is it that we want to see in 3 years' time, or in 5 years' time, or 1 year's time, whatever? So it's not so easy, and I'll be coming back to this in the last session, because you'll have to have key performance indicators to carry out your monitoring and evaluation. So we'll come back to it. But it is something to do quite a lot of thinking about, and you've got Christmas and New Year and January to do a bit of thinking about it, because it's a fairly important area. And when you're talking about sensitive social issues, there's often another dimension to it, such as political, which needs to be addressed as well in the project. And, you know, political change, no one wants to give up power. If men have power over women, if heterosexuals have power over homosexuals, if police have power over ordinary citizens, those things, some of them are okay and some need to be changed. If they need to be changed, the project needs to be aware of that. It can be one of your risk factors. If those attitudes are not changed, it can be a risk to your project. So it's a big area, and lots of thinking is very helpful. Okay, Suzanne, we'll go back to the next. Oh, you're on it. Inputs and budget. Does anyone have any questions about, can you go back to the last one, Suze? The last slide. Does anyone have any questions on the ultimate benefits of a project and what costs there might be associated with those benefits?
Just unmute yourself, anyone who does. And I just want to say, I thought that was a brilliant example and of the way that you analyzed that project title, Sandy, and said, you know, it's ultimately about confidence. And so what would that look like to them? That's just a piece of gold for me. That makes this entire workshop a success for me. So thank you.
Well, bye-bye, everyone. I'll go home.
No. Anybody else?
I'm gonna say not yet, Sandy. You can't go. I totally agree with Suzanne. I think that's what I was really present to, is just that when we're looking at the project itself, and particularly with the scope, like I was looking at the scope as being super finite. And I did not consider so many other possibilities of needing to answer certain questions. So this has really opened up my eyes and also points to the importance of having a focus group, which I will definitely do.
Good, yeah. Focus groups are also, they shouldn't be self-serving, they should be open. So you want a representative body of people, age-wise, ethnic groups, whatever. Make sure your focus group's made up of people who do represent beneficiaries who hopefully going to get the goodies at the end. So we'll go on to the next slide then about inputs. Now, budgets are very common. Most people know how to do a financial budget. They don't always say where the money came from. They simply give amounts that will be needed by the project. It is useful to know where that money is going to come from. If it's promised, then how risky is that? People say they'll fund something. Are they 100% committed? Or is it something you may have to do fundraising? So I've got those three categories: loans and grants, donations, and fundraising. It may be that there's a fourth category. You have money already in your coffers. I know our club does. We have a certain amount because we have a dinner every month and people pay for it, and it makes money. And so there's a project budget always with money in it that can be brought in for a new project sometimes. But then the side that people don't think about is the non-financial budget. Which resources are going to be absolutely crucial to the success of your project? And this might mean human expertise, for example. And that might mean that you have that expertise within the club, you know somebody who will provide it, or you're going to have to hire it in and pay for it, in which case the financial side of the budget has to reflect that. And sometimes it's money very well spent to get the right kind of expertise to advise you on something at the right time. So that's one area. You know, club members are usually very willing to help, but they don't always have the skills that are needed for a particular project. And there are many experts willing to give their time free of charge, but sometimes you do need to budget in the financial column for some expertise. Equipment and technology, the main, we're not building roads, so bulldozers and trucks and things won't be part of your project. But there are often things like software that could be very helpful. Even budgeting, financial software for keeping your accounts more easily and so on. It pays, I think, to have the right kind of software for dealing with whatever you're dealing with in your project. And sometimes we've just invested in our club, for example, in a great big, I don't know how many terabytes, external hard drive to put all our digital photos onto for the archives. Now, it was quite expensive. There was a little bit of murmuring in the club when I mentioned that would be $120. But, you know, that will preserve them for the long term. It will allow cataloging. It will allow titling. And it's going to make everything in the archives so much easier. So, you know, I do get a bit frustrated with people who are against spending any money on things. They say we can do that ourselves. Volunteers do it. Well, volunteers do a good job, but sometimes a bit of money spent on some equipment or technology is very well spent. And then the volunteer input, I think there's a danger that we assume our members will provide unlimited volunteer hours. And we do need to anticipate how many of those hours we need when, because there are busy times. And I know for myself, I don't plan anything in school holidays because all the women with school-age children are not available for volunteering. So just putting volunteers without looking at timeframes and how many hours are required, even if it's unskilled labor, people have to be willing to give the hours when they're needed. One of our best fundraising things here in Nelson is hiring out academic gowns to schools for prize giving and to the Polytech and so on for graduation ceremonies. But those are all in November. And so we need a lot of volunteer hours in November and quite a few in December too. And that's a busy time here in New Zealand. It's beginning of summer, people are thinking about holidays, Christmas is coming, etc. So we had to go beyond the club and rake in some other volunteers to help us with things like scholarship application forms and packing the gowns for people, schools that ordered them for their prize giving and so on. There's lots of unskilled labor, but we need the hours. So we have about 40 people on our list of volunteers. Only half of them are Soroptimists. Okay, next slide, please. Now the work plan and timeline, this will be very different for different projects. You might not want to put all these things. Suze, if you could just go to the next slide and then come back to this one, I'll just show you one format that I've found quite useful. Can we see the next slide? Just looking at the one that's on the screen now, you can just put those headings if you want to make a work plan and timeline. That'll do. But if you want to put it into a table format, and I think Suze will get to that shortly when she's found the right buttons to press, that's another format. There's no right or wrong in this. Whatever works for you. Yes, this is the one that I use quite a lot because it's got the major activities in the left-hand column, and then it's got the key inputs that are associated with that activity. And those are financial and material resources and the human input. And then I've got start dates and end dates for that activity. And all the activities will lead to one or other of the objectives. So that sheet will probably be a whole page, might be 2 pages, depends on the project. And then it's good to have a contact person responsible for each activity, just so that they report to the project leader when necessary and can contact people, volunteers or whoever they need to contact. So that's just a format that I've developed and found very useful, but you can look on different things on the internet and find hundreds of them. Whatever works for you, just use it. If you go back now, Suze, is that possible to go back? Yes. So the key things to know in your work plan and timeline are, what are the major activities? Now, you don't list every activity, of course, because some activities are so small and they just get done. But the major ones, especially where you need to haul in other resources or you need to pay for something ahead of time, you need to anticipate that these will be resources needed for that activity. And therefore, the person who's the main contact person for that activity has to do something ahead of time. So it helps keep things ordered. So all the key activities with milestones, if you want. A milestone shows, you know, the completion of that task. What resources, financial, material, human. The time frame, and I find it useful to know approximately when it will start and approximately when it will end. That's not the project start and end, it's just that activity start and end. And there'll be some activities that go on right through, like monitoring. Who's in charge of monitoring, collecting information for monitoring? That will go right through the project. But there'll be other activities, such as an education session on something or an awareness raising session on something that will start and end, perhaps within a week or a month or a year, but won't run through the whole project. And the person responsible. There's a lot of responsibility attached to seeing that things get done. Because there'll be other things that depend on your activity to be done on time so that their activity can start on time. So team building, you know, that's a good part of a project. If you have good relations and you enjoy doing what you're doing, everybody will be happy. And I find particularly with volunteers, the happier they are, the more they're willing to do more volunteering. And we see that in what we call op shops here in New Zealand, charity shops that sell used products for very little money. The people who volunteer to work in those shops stay with that shop if they're treated well by the management. The others, they're forever looking for volunteers to help them. So just giving them morning tea and little talks and saying thank you, you know, that helps a lot. An email saying we really appreciate what you've been doing. So yes, responsibility to get things done. Some people just know how to do it. They know how, they're people. And others are managers that like to be more distant from the activity. They're not the ones to appoint for that sort of activity. Okay, so we'll go on to the next one. We dealt with that, so the next. Good. Now, I said next time, so that's going to be in February, I think, we will talk about monitoring and evaluation and reporting, because this information is going to be useful for reporting to the various stakeholders who want to know certain things. And in your stakeholder analysis, it's always useful to find out from them what they expect from you in terms of a report. Some will say they need very little, the odd email or the odd phone call or the odd visit would be fine. Others want quite detailed accounting of money or of activities or progress or obstacles, whatever. And so if you can get that clear early on, then you're going to be able to design your monitoring and evaluation plan to meet their needs and not have to scramble around at the last minute to find the data they need. So not everybody will want a written report. And in fact, probably very few want a written report. Some will be happy with the paragraph or two that's in your club's annual report, and that will be enough for them. But you will find, particularly if they're major donors or major partners in an activity, that they actually want something more. And as I said in the last session, it can be as informal as a before and after photograph, showing how it was and how it is now. That can be a monitoring tool that's very quick and easy to do. Everybody has a phone with a camera on it. You can snap a picture and caption it, and that will be your reporting tool. However, when you need to collect information and data, that needs to be planned and provided for in your resources. Statistical data, there are plenty of programs that will do that for you with them on the computer, as long as you have someone to put in the information. And for financial accounting, of course, there are endless software programs that will do their good job there. But it's the analysis of the data that's the important part. And this, I find, the numbers themselves don't speak very much at all. They give you the bare facts, but they don't talk about how people feel about the project or what impacts it's had on their lives, the social consequences of some activities, the changes in Darlene's example, the changes that happen in people's minds about how they're accepted or not accepted, and the confidence that comes from that in allowing them to go into new activities they never thought of undertaking before. So these things are much more difficult to measure, but they can be the most important result of your project. Particularly, I think, with areas of education and awareness raising. So I will be dealing with that in the final session, but just for now, at the project design stage, you do need to know what your stakeholders want from you in terms of reporting. And most of it will be very informal, and probably a very friendly encounter. But there will be some who require statistical data, financial data, and maybe output data. Okay. Talking about number 3 in that list, analysis. You know, again, it depends on the nature of your project and the scope of your project, but there are a lot of people who analyze very superficially. They take the numbers, the facts, and just report on them with a sentence, a narrative, saying this is what happened. There's no interpretation, there's no heart, there's no feeling in the report. And for much of the work Soroptimists do to change the lives of women and girls, it's these things, the social change, that's more important. It happens as a result of political and economic change, yes, but it's how people, how they run their lives, how they take control of their lives, how they are confident to go forth into the world and do something that they didn't do before. If you can capture those things, that's a good analyst who looks at the data or the photographs or the information and says, I can see that this has had a profound impact on people's lives. And they write that in the narrative. That's a very important report. Whether it's done through a presentation with some pictures, or it's a written narrative with data attached as annexes, whatever fits the occasion, doesn't matter. But I do find reporting is mostly just dry statistics and facts, and everybody says we did a good job, that's finished, on to the next project. So any questions on that?
Yes, I have one. I'm thinking about Dream It, Be It again, and asking participants for comments afterwards, and what's evident in those comments. For instance, I can remember in our Dream It, Be It asking, would you recommend this to other, to your friends, to other girls? And I don't know, 90-some% saying yes. We've also asked a question like, what's, not in so many words, but what's your takeaway from the day? What are you, what's your big aha? And on one of my favorite responses, which I quote often, is a girl who said what she learned was that we can do anything we want, and everyone has their own path, and life is not linear, and I always thought it was.
That's very profound.
So is that and Darlene or Sue's or April, you might have other examples of feedback that girls have given. So I guess my question is, I think it's profound, and my question is, how do we use those sorts of quotes that we're getting from people?
Well, I would put them in a box and have the text wrapped around it. You know, a box that just gives a little quote like that, it's quite heartwarming, and it lightens the report. Reports can be very boring, and that would lift the temper of the report, I think. A photograph of the girl who said it, maybe, if she's willing. I also find that direct questions, and you ask them to reply as an individual, doesn't elicit as much heartfelt response as in a focus group or any group where people encourage each other. One person's comments touches something in another, and she will add to it. And so it evolves from the group rather than from each individual. So that's very useful too. Depends on the kind of group, of course, but it's the same with surveys, I find, with social surveys particularly. When I'm asked a question, my immediate reply would be, if I could say to the person behind the screen, what do you mean by such and such? Then I would know how to answer it, but I don't have anything to guide me in what they mean. What's your opinion about the policy on increasing the police force? Well, what the hell do they mean? I don't know what to say to them. So I'm a great believer in group interaction for eliciting responses that have more depth and more emotion and more of what we're trying to achieve, more of the change in one's life reflected. So statistics have their place, and using scales, that's something else I'll talk about in the next session. But doing assessments by whatever method can be hugely enriched with the group feeding into the process.
So, okay, so let me ask a follow-up question there, Sandy, because I think in order to get the responses, you have to ask the right questions.
That's right.
And I'm sometimes, more like often, irritated with some of the evaluation stuff that our Federation headquarters sends out for something like Dream It Be It. So, for instance, were you exposed to career role models? Yes. So then because we've got a career fair with 10 or 30 women, or we've got a careers panel of 4 women. So yes, they were, right? And so then headquarters will say, great, it's a success because they were exposed to career role models. And to me,
it's a lie they're telling by saying that they've achieved something, because they don't actually know from that question. It's like, I taught 36 women how to cook raspberry jam last week. And so 36 women know how to make raspberry jam. They haven't a clue whether those 36 women actually learned. What they should have said is 36 women went home and made raspberry jam after the training. That would tell you that there are 36 women who know how to make raspberry jam, but we don't. And those SI Federation statistics are so bereft of any meaning apart from the simple fact that an activity was done.
Right.
But the impact, that's why I keep going on about impact. It's not what you did or what resources were used or how much money was spent. Those are just steps to achieve an impact, and a lasting impact, a sustainable impact.
Okay, so because the girls, don't want to spend a lot of time filling out, an evaluation form. And I can imagine that the question, instead of saying, were you exposed to careers that you didn't know about, which is sort of a useless question, if the question is something along the lines of what careers that you didn't know about, sound interesting to you, or I don't know, something like that, right? But so the trick again, I think, is to figure out a question that won't necessarily take them very long to answer, or is it useful at the end of the day? When you said you get richer information from a focus group, is it more useful at the end of the day to say, anybody shout out what your takeaway is from today? And like is it worth allotting time for that sort of thing?
Yes, well, I would say it's much more useful to do that. I mean, we have endless records on school and university reports about people's grades and how well they did and how many attendances. They have these registers of attendance, and they say the course was wonderful because it reached 147 people. But the impact of that training, we don't have a clue. So it's not what I taught, it's what did people learn and apply in their lives. So I go back again to the framing of the objectives. The objectives are not what you plan to do. They're what you plan to achieve as a result of what you do. So it's a discipline you have to acquire in writing objectives if you really want to be able to monitor impact at the end. And you can get it from surveys, but not many people know how to write a survey or an evaluation form. They don't know how to write it in a way that elicits this kind of feedback. It's easy to ask, did they enjoy it on a scale of 1 to 6? How did you find that class? 1, you didn't enjoy it much, and 6, you loved it. But what does it tell you about impact? Nothing. So they've got numbers. It looks like it's highly skillfully evaluated, but the meaning is actually very, very little. And SI is full of it. And
So
SI is just one of every, I mean, almost all of them have our own ministries. The government ministries are full of it. It's all about how many resources were used and how many people attended, and impact is not shown up.
So just building on Suzanne's point about, asking about immediate impact. I'm April Neve from Chilliwack, BC. I recall a Dream It Be It that we did as well. And we had a smaller group. Our early groups were small, 12 to 15 girls. And as we handed out the certificates, before we handed out the certificates, we did ask them directly, what is your takeaway? And it was really like, it was immediate, and you can record that information as well.
Yes.
And this is the early days when we did ours, and we didn't have a kind of a trade affair of mentors. We just did a speed networking with our own volunteers of 12, maybe 10 to 12 Soroptimists. And so for a number of them, they did comment that the speed networking session was very good. Like, we had a timed session of maybe 2 minutes, and we actually provided them with questions if they didn't have a question of their own that they'd like to ask the Soroptimists, and about their profession and their professional life. And as I said, they were asked about, okay, what was your takeaway from the day, as we handed out the certificates. And it was just very good information. It was quick, it was immediate, it can be recorded, and certainly valuable for planning the next Dream It Be It as well. So what's working, what's not working? Yeah.
That's a good example. Yes, very good example. And I'm sure you'll all think of ways that are meaningful to measure your own outputs and outcomes. So can we see the next slide? It's going to show you, there it is, another way of just having a table to plan, because we're still talking about project design planning, just to see what your KPIs are, what will be measured in a table format. You can do it with narrative if you want to, under some headings, but this is a nice crisp way of sort of condensing it into a table that shows you exactly what has to be done by whom and against what criteria and standards. So the first example is the number of participants attending each session. Now that will tell you absolutely nothing about what learning took place. And I put it there for that reason. It's very, very commonly reported how many women benefited from blah, blah, blah. Doesn't tell you a thing. The criteria and standards, they'll have percentages and ratios, and they'll even disaggregate by male and female. Still tells you nothing about what they learned or what they felt, what they gained, what their takeaway was. And the method will be the session register. Very easy to do, quick and easy and dirty. And they've got people responsible. But what can you analyze actually from that? Nothing. You can analyze how many bodies came and plonked themselves down on the seat and sat there for an hour and went away with nothing in their heads. So I like to be extreme sometimes, but you get the meaning. Whereas the second one is an example of how you might measure something that's happened. That's measuring their competence level. And to do that, it may be competence in terms of a skill or knowledge or a change in attitudes. The three areas of learning: cognitive or mental, manual or skills, and values, attitudes, etc. Head, heart, hands, we say. Learning through the head, the heart, the hands. And you measure the three differently. So knowledge is measured by measuring whether they can tell you something, measuring whether they remember things, measuring whether they can analyze and solve problems. And there are ways that educators can do this. Again, it'll come up in the next session, but just briefly, if you want to measure competence or learning, you need to put it in your M&E plan, because it means somebody, either the teacher or some people that are associated with providing that education or awareness raising, will have to take some measurements and keep a record. Not necessarily after every session, but after every period of time where a competence level should have been reached. And of course, that requires that they set some standards or criteria by which they judge competence has been achieved. And I've got the criterion there, which is at least 80% at level 4. You'll have systems in Canada and in Africa and so on that measure education. We have 5 levels here for secondary schools, levels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And level 5 is fully competent to do something. And level 1 is just beginning to acquire skills or knowledge. So you set your criteria and standards according to what you expect to come out of your activity, and then keep records. And not everybody will be fully competent at the end of any session, but you want to have an objective of at least a certain percent will demonstrate competence. And you often do it by having them practice it in front of you, or repeat it to you, or explain something to you. 2-year-olds are very good at that. They will explain to you how they want to prepare their next meal, for example. And you can measure their success. Right. So we're coming to the end now. Just if we can have the last slide. Well, this reporting schedule. I mentioned a little while ago that you need to just discuss with your key stakeholders what reporting they need. And if a verbal report's all they need, fine. You can do that when you meet them, or a phone call or an email, or you might invite them along to the project. I must say, with our girls in Nelson, girls and women who get scholarships from us, we invite them to a little dinner party at the end of the year, and they tell us about their year. And for most members of our club, that's enough, that they express their appreciation, they've had success, they're proud of themselves, usually. Sometimes they're the first in their family to have tertiary education, and it helped them get over some financial hardship. So a verbal report is often enough. But if you have to have written reports, and if they require data, then you need to make sure that that's collected. Not necessarily by you, not necessarily by the project even. I think may have only been to Suzanne when I first talked about this series of workshops, that we used to use high school students to do time use studies in an African country I worked in. And they loved that, because at the end of their holidays, if they'd done enough time use studies with families, they got to keep the watch that we gave them, the wristwatch. which was given to them to keep time, but they got to keep that as a reward for their work. Now that was Africa, where maybe they'd want more than that in Canada and New Zealand, but high school students are very good at relating to people and sitting quietly and just doing what we call participant observation of what's going on around them. What we were trying to capture was how much time spent by men and by women on domestic chores. And they didn't know what was being recorded, but interesting information came out of that. So the budget would have to show the cost of 110 wristwatches. In the format, a typical report format is an analytical narrative supported by appendices or annexes with data. So the analytical narrative should capture what the data is telling them in a very concise narrative report, not pages and pages and pages of description that would put them to sleep very quickly. It's a skill, and the people who write reports usually develop this skill over time. The more concise, the better, because the data is all there attached at the back, and it will hopefully stimulate the person reading it to go on supporting you, not to withdraw their funding because you've met your objectives and they've done their bit. So think about who's reading it. If it's a written report, a concise analytical narrative summarizing the data attached. That's what we're looking for. I've had reports that are purely visual. I'll show you some in the final session of what we've used to show demographic data, for example, and the changing of dependency ratios. That can be done for people who are not literate or have very limited literacy and numeracy skills. And it's very dramatic to be able to show things. I mentioned time use studies too. That's dramatic when you present people with time use material. And I know your country and ours have done these things at a national level. It's very interesting to show up discrepancies in the allocation of tasks within the household and within the community and around the business table and boards of directors and so on. You can show a lot of things that are going on that people don't think about even until they see it in a time use study. So that's been a valuable tool, and that involves no statistics. I do it with the color coded graph showing certain color means unpaid work, another color means paid work, another color is community work, etc. And I'll demonstrate that next time. Photographs are very useful. If you take photographs right through the project, that will be a nice way to break up the narrative in your report. Cartoons, if you're good at sketching, you can do a bit of humor in the report, but mostly reports are serious documents. Frequency. Many people will be happy with an annual report, but it depends on the project, of course. Some people want monthly reports. You yourself may want monthly reports. Your treasurer may require monthly reports. And so you have to schedule these things according to the needs of the stakeholders. And the content, don't forget, the content is not all hallelujah. It's also what risks, what challenges, what problems were overcome, and what harm was done, if any. Who are the victims of your project? Hopefully there won't be any, but if you don't think about it, there may well be. And they may be victims who you never thought about before. They may be victims of some environmental effects, or they may have lost access to resources they once had. So the whole range of things goes into that narrative, not all supported by data, but you have to be careful not to bring in opinions and assumptions and so on. The report is a hard-nosed document based on fact as far as possible. So that's it for today, and we're 1 minute over time already, I see. Anyone got any burning question? I can have the next slide showing. It's just the big question mark. And then the final slide. We'll wind up. Okay. If anyone wants the presentation from the slides today, Suzanne will send them to you. And if you want to contact me about anything at all, just flick me an email and you'll get a quick reply, I hope.
I will send the slides out to everyone who registered, whether they could attend or not. And I'll send your email along as well, Sandy. That was absolutely brilliant as far as I'm concerned. So thank you so very much. And I just can't wait to get started on planning.
Reach my objective then. Thank you all. See you in February.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Take care.